Mr. Speaker, I'm just going to ask our colleagues, Mr. Zeller at his 100th birthday, his hearing isn't quite as good, so if you could join me and try to keep the hall as quiet as possible so he could possibly hear my remarks. I wanted to honor him on his 100th birthday and thank him for his service to our country. Joe's a personal friend of mine and a personal advisor. Joe actually sat on that side of the aisle, the opposite side of the aisle, which I sit. But Joe has still been a tireless worker for the community and an advisor that I take his information about the history of the Hall of the House and issues that we wrestle with today, he wrestled with 20 and 30 years ago. Joe has been a tireless worker for veterans with the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in downtown Allentown, one of those monuments where when you're 10 years old, it's a very old monument. One of those monuments that can fade into history unless people like Joe Zeller stand forward. The Korea-Vietnam Memorial, through my entire adult life, worked hard to move it to the place of where it could actually be located over 10 years that it took to do that. Allentown's Flag Day. But to give you an idea of his mind, Joe established a program. He went to Boy Scout events long after he was a state representative where they retire flags, where they dispose of flags in the proper ceremony. And Joe sat there and he said, what's the next thing we can do? Because Joe gets up and speaks to these kids. I get up and speak to these kids. And what we try to do is we try to connect the next generation to what our veterans' sacrifices are. And he came up with a program he calls Ashes to Graves, where he encourages Boy Scout troops and anyone that retires flags to take those ashes and then have another ceremony at the veterans' graves and disperse of the ashes on veterans' graves, an issue that I think all of you should consider doing in your district. As we honor him on 100 years, not just of life, but of service to our community and also the Commonwealth and the country, I want to thank him for his personal advice to me over the years. Joe is an important advisor to me still to this day. He's given me advice and history on liquor privatization. He grabbed my shirt, pulled me close and said, hey, you must consider this. Don't forget about that. Marcellus Shale, tax issues, public officials' corruption, veterans issues. He talked to me about the PCCD and its formation, how we use the PCCD today for so many things of good quality public government. Public officials and the troubles that public officials had years ago are similar to the problems that public officials have today with corruption. And he grabbed my shirt and pulled me close and said, make sure you don't do this. And what he was advising me seemed like, well, that's not corruption, that's not, he said, but that's what leads to the next step and the next step. Like a father, like a grandfather, like a great-grandfather, giving me advice. By the time he was my age, he had probably 1.5 careers completed at that time. And I didn't even know him at that time. I wasn't even born at that time. Joe's story of public service, 25 years ago, I was just out of college, and I had a choice between a public sector position and a private sector position. And I called my dad, a private sector guy. He said, no brainer. Take the job, you're gonna be part owner of a company. Take that job. That's security for you and your family. Then I called Joe and I said, hey, Joe, could you give me some advice? He was in his 70s at that time. Joe said, sure, I'm putting insulation in the basement. He's in his 70s and he's putting insulation in his basement. He said, I'm not gonna stop that, but I'll give you advice, come on over. I was in the basement holding insulation as he was attaching it to his wall. And he said, are you kidding me? That's not even a choice. And I thought, oh, he's gonna say the same thing that my dad said. He said the complete opposite. He said, pay doesn't matter. That'll all come. You're a good guy. You're doing good things. Compensation will come later. But do you imagine the people you're going to be able to meet? The job was executive to the mayor of Allentown, the third largest city in Pennsylvania. He said there's 150 of these jobs in the country. Do you realize the amount of people you can help in that position? Joe changed me radically. Joe made me think and made an impression on my soul. Those two job offers, you hear about rich dad, poor dad. I had corporate dad and political dad, public sector dad maybe. And that's who Joe is to me then and who he is now. He said, oh my goodness, can you realize the amount of people you can help? That's why it's important to me today to honor Joe on his 100th birthday, say thank you personally for your service to the Commonwealth, our country, and our community. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me again in welcoming Joe Zeller back to the Hall of the House and saying thank you for his great service to our country. Close it.